conducting humane code reviews, and want to get this started here. So just a little bit, super quick, I wrote a book called Coding for Kids Python. It is probably one of the hardest things I've ever done in my career. I wrote this within a span of 3 months while working full-time, not here at MongoDB, working full-time as a software engineer at a smaller company here in Las Vegas. So it was certainly worth it, but very, very difficult. I also teach on LinkedIn Learning. So right now I have 2 courses. They're focused on cloud development. So the first one is automating your Azure workflow. So this is a course that I wish I had when I first started out in my .NET career, where, you know, they teach you how to code, they teach you C#, but then after that, that's it. You know, they don't teach you the bigger picture of what do you now do with this program? How do you properly version control it? How do you deploy it? All of those things. And so that's one course that I created that I was very, very happy about. And I hope other juniors or anybody that is new to .NET development or development in general will find use with that course. And then the latest course that I have done is a little bit longer. It's the Azure Essential Training for Developers. So this takes a high-level overview of everything you could possibly want to know as a developer if you were just starting out in Azure. Azure and cloud is super overwhelming in general, especially if you have no experience with it. You know, there's so many services, so many tools. What do you use? What is relevant to you as a dev? And so I kind of go over that at a high level, but enough to make sure you'd be able to be comfortable working in Azure. And I talked about Azure Durable Functions, not yesterday. This is a slide. These slides are actually available on my GitHub, so if you wanted to follow along. But I like to talk about Azure-specific services. So yes, I'm a developer advocate at Mongo, but my background is in C# and .NET. So anything that is more related to Azure and Azure Cloud nowadays is probably what I would rather be talking about. All right, so without further ado, who here has performed a code review? You don't have to open your camera, but you can probably raise your hand. Yep, I see some hands. Yep, awesome. I would hope that we have all at least performed one. Now, when you think about the code review process itself, I want to ask you, why do you think we perform them? Why do we do them? There are some obvious answers. There are answers that may not be so obvious. And as you're thinking about these answers, you may find that these are really our kind of like our ideal code review goals. So what are those goals? Why do we do them? And there are 4 goals that I think overarch any development team that I think in my discussions with other developers always come back and back again. They always fall within these 4 main themes or goals. The first and foremost is to catch design flaws. Does this code make sense? Is it supposed to be in this code base, or should it be extracted out and into its own library? Does it integrate well with the rest of your code base? Overall, we look for these things because we obviously don't want to degrade the health of our code base. And so when you think of code reviews, this is probably the first thing that comes to mind. You know, you look for, are any parallel threads being done safely? Are there race conditions? Are there logic errors? These are the things we want to catch and should be catching in code review processes. Next thing, so ensuring code clarity and coherence. So just as creating well-designed code and writing well-designed code is of the utmost importance, probably next most important is making sure we understand it. So, you know, it could be the most well-architected piece of code, but if it's taking you longer to understand, if you have to reread this code, it's probably too complex. And I'm pretty sure us as developers, most of us, we are paid a pretty penny to be able to solve some pretty complex problems, to architect really complex systems, to do a lot of really you know, logic-based and puzzle solving. So if we who get paid this large amount of money are assumed to be very, very smart people are having trouble reading some portions of code, then it's not us, it's the code. We need to change it. Other things about code is that if it's too complex, if you can't understand it right away, what can you change about it so that it is easier to understand? You shouldn't be taking 20 seconds, 40 seconds to understand a couple lines of code. Or if the logic is too complex, you need to change it to either add more comments or rework it or something. The point is it needs to be clear, and it being clear means it's less hard to refactor it later on, and there's less chances for bugs to be hiding in that complexity. So clear code, easy to understand code should be synonymous with creating well-designed code. Those two should always be together. Next, we want to validate the necessity of this code. Is this something that is needed at this time? Maybe, especially on larger teams, where maybe communication is not as great, or the tracking systems, maybe not everybody is using Jira as thoroughly and as consistently as possible. Sometimes there are just things that are not needed. Somebody has spent so much time working on a feature that was either not vetted, that did not have a ticket assigned to it, where you needed it, or maybe, I don't know, they were in the weeds and you didn't know that the thing that they were using is actually about to be deprecated in 2 weeks. You want to make sure that what is being merged or is about to be merged into your code base is required. Do we need this right now? And you have to bring that up if you see that it is not needed. And at the very, very least, you want to confirm the functionality. So this has been getting a lot better with a lot of the tools and services we have, especially the automation that we have built in. We're getting spoiled with either GitHub Actions or tasks. We can have automated builds. We can do so many things here to help us confirm that things are working the way that they're supposed to. But I know, especially, for smaller companies, at least the company that I used to work for, it's very common. It's like a team of 5 engineers, and we had to wear many hats. We were our own DevOps team. We were our own QA department. We were the devs. We were everything, and we had to make sure that everything was working, and we didn't have any other teams to kind of push off some of the other work to. So part of that is having this responsibility to double check if it's a UI change, especially if you don't have automated tests to do this for you, then it is your responsibility. It should be your due diligence as a dev to pull that branch down, make sure it runs, and see that it's working on all browsers. See that that button is where it's supposed to be. See that it's doing what the developer intends it to do. That should be something that we absolutely should be checking in the code review, especially if we do not have automated processes to do it for us. So I'm going to ask again, after hearing all of those ideal goals of happy path, this is how every code review should be, and thinking about your own code review processes, who here loves doing a code review? Anybody? Kind of. I see less hands, and that's exactly the point I'm trying to make. For the most part, when this discussion comes up, this is the response, right? Nobody absolutely loves their process. Nobody is advocating for it, saying it is the best thing and that it works, that teams don't have tension among them after doing it, that there's absolutely no problems within it. And I want, we always ask why. Why do so many developers dread doing a code review? It is one of the most essential pieces of our workflow. It is one of the most important things that we have to do as devs. And yet we all, think of it as like getting a root canal. And when I speak to other developers, watch some other talks, and just read other stories of devs, there usually, again, are some themes around it. There's 3 code review complaints that I hear time and time again that I'm sure most teams have fallen victim to. So I want to talk to you today about what those are to maybe show you or make you be aware of possible things that we may be doing and how they affect our process, affect our team, how they make the code review process overall just be a really crappy process, something that we don't want to do. And rather than just talk to you and complain, I also want to give you strategies on how we can do better on some of those complaints. So what are the top 3 complaints? Number 1, subjectivity. Number 2, tone of voice. And number 3, process loopholes. I'm sure anything that you may have thought of when you said, oh, well, I don't really like this part about our code review, I almost guarantee you it's going to fall within one of these 3. So let's start with subjectivity. What is subjective? What is subjective, especially in the context of code reviews? We've all had these kinds of comments before. Here's an example. This is from the materialized repo, and indentation. Somebody says indentation. These are an example of something that is subjective. And I know this can get super heated, but trust me, when I get to the why this should not be brought up in code reviews, it should make a little bit more sense. So another example of what's subjective. This, for example, is from a pull request on the hands-on table repo. You'll see here that there are specific lines I've underlined here in yellow. And these, in the context of the entire pull request, what happened was there was a feature that was requested. So this is an open source repo. Feature was requested, it was vetted, and someone took the time to do this. They implemented this thing that the community around this repo has asked for. And in the end, what that person implemented worked. It worked and it was vetted to the specs that was communicated within this issue. And so the problem with this one, at first you're like, oh, this is super thorough. This actually may look like a good code review comment. But these words here, what this person was saying is, okay, it's fine for doing exactly what was vetted, which is getting the extremities of hands-on table is almost like a web-based Excel sheet. You can implement Excel-like sheets into your application, and get selected was just getting a portion of that. So that was fulfilled by this request. But this person now, this one that I have showing, was saying, oh, it would have been better to do this, and it should have been returning in this specific form, and it should have been put here. So these are things that are almost like premature optimizations. These are things that were not vetted. They were more like preferences of this particular developer. And to make matters worse, this person was not approving it because of these reasons. So if this was just like suggestions saying, oh, maybe for next time we can extend this to do all of these things that he just requested and preferred, but no, they blocked the pull request because they didn't want to do this. And so in that sense, those kinds of comments are fairly subjective. And there are many other examples of what subjective code review comments are. There are things like, you should really indent lines 23 and 27, or come on, replace var with const, it's 2020. Or I'd rather use regexes here. Or something like total number of users is better than total users. These are exactly the kinds of comments that I can feel are synonymous with a bunch of developers when we say we absolutely dread doing code reviews, is because there's so many different opinions and we can get into so many heated debates and work gets stopped. Things are delayed and bottlenecked because at the point of code reviews, people argue about this stuff. And while some things have merit in getting done to have a discussion about with your coworker, there are some that can be completely avoided and don't need to be there, especially at this point in the process of a code review. So what can we do better about subjective code review comments? Well, before you do anything, before you take any suggestion that I make in this presentation, the first thing that you need to do is to gain consensus with your team. So without being on the same page as your team, there's going to be continued discussions. There's going to be continued debates, and there's going to be continued bottlenecks because you're going to run into the same patterns of maybe having these subjective comments show up in the first place, or just not being on the same page of what your team is going to enforce, especially with the standards of your code base. So how do we do this? How do we get the team on board all together? One strategy that has worked very well for my past teams is to develop something, a team working agreement, and enforce it. So if you've not heard of it, or like, what's a team working agreement? This was kind of repurposed from the agile world, where originally it's just the team agrees to certain processes about, what is going to be okay on their team. In the code review specific context, and really in like the engineering team context, we created a similar document, still called it a team working agreement, but this is where we put things like, what is the actual code review process? How many reviewers need to approve before it is merged? What are your style guidelines on naming conventions? How should you structure your particular code base? What kinds of functions belong in a library and which ones go in your main project? All of these things, the things that usually start debates or arguments among teams, these should all be talked about at least once or twice among your team before you actually try to start enforcing it. The whole purpose of this document is just to say, you and your team have taken the time to have yet another meeting, but this is probably one of the more important meetings that you'll have. It's because during those meetings is when you should be discussing all of these things. And hopefully by the time that you have all debated and shared your opinions on how you should enforce these kinds of code standards for your team, at the very end, you come up with this document that says all of you, the entire team, has agreed on these particular sets of standards and processes and rules. And by having this discussion beforehand, it makes it much easier to say if someone is not following your standards later on, it's much nicer to refer back to this document to say, hey, we all agreed on this. We all discussed this at length. These are the standards. These are the rules. These are the conventions we have agreed upon. This is how our code is supposed to look like, and you're clearly going against these guidelines. So it's much easier to defend any code review comments that go against this, because ideally your whole team has agreed upon them before. So once you're all on the same page, you're all on the same team and are agreeing to enforce whatever it is, whatever those standards look like, the next thing is let the robots take over. And what I mean by that is there are so many services and so many tools that we have at our disposal as developers that take care of a lot of the subjective comments that are being made, and they are way better at it anyway. So what does this look like? Well, to start, things like Prettier and ESLint. So there have been many teams that I've talked to that are not using it. And these are things where you can work with your team, make this part of your team working agreement to say, hey, we don't actually have any kind of style guide. And when I say style guide, I mean naming conventions, but it can also be your style palette for your application, like your brand colors, all of that stuff, but style guide more specifically to naming conventions, structure of your code base, percentage of tests covered, all of these things that matter should be enforced by tools like this. The reason I bring up Prettier and ESLint also is because if you are just there are a lot of teams that don't have something to start with. Everyone kind of brings in their own experience and says, oh, well, I worked on the team for 11 years then, and we did our naming this way and it has always worked. And someone else here is like, well, no, we use this kind of casing because it just makes so much more sense. So when you have these different opinions and don't have a cohesive one for your current team, you can always start out with the base that is provided by Prettier and then adapt it to your team. And then use ESLint, use all of these kinds of plugins and tools to do the work for you. I find it that it's always better for devs to take this kind of critique of indentation, of spacing, of these little things. They respond much better to when the computer tells them rather than to see it pointed out by a colleague in a code review comment, especially if your code review or your PR is littered with all of these comments of like little indentation comments. Those are the worst. So why not take care of it beforehand, get rid of it, fix it right away, and not even have it be an issue in your code review. There was a talk by Philip here. I spoke at this conference and I went to his talk, and specifically for C#, use the editor config, use the Roslyn analyzers. They're akin to the tools that I mentioned earlier, which is more for like JavaScript. Web development uses it a lot, but we have our own tools for the C# language, and we should be utilizing that. We should be, again, breaking down what it is our standards and style looks like for our C# code base, and we should be using it because, again, the more that you can fix beforehand, the more that you can format your code, get all of that out of the way and have it be in a condition and a state that your whole team has already agreed to by the time it gets to the code review, then you don't spend countless hours, wasted hours debating it, or even you as the reviewer, you don't have to be there going indentation, this, that, this is wrong. Those are so many wasted hours that can be saved by implementing these kinds of tools. Next, so you get all of that out of the way, you get all of the lower hanging fruit, the things that can be automated and dealt with robots, with tools. So what's next in subjectivity? Well, objectivity always wins. So what is objective? Objective things, objective comments, are comments that usually refer back to one of the code review goals that I explained earlier. They never, ever, ever refer back to the dev. They never even misconstrue that what the dev did was dumb, was stupid, was idiotic, that the developer themselves are wrong. It always can neatly direct, or it neatly refer back to one of the goals. So what does that look like? An example would be, this change should probably go into our utils library. It will be reused quite a bit. It has nothing to do with the developer. It has nothing, an alternative to this. A real comment that was actually said was, why are you doing this? This should be going into a separate library. And that's it. That was the only thing said in the comment. But instead of attacking the dev right away, you can focus it back to what is the problem at hand here and explain why it should be going into wherever it is you're suggesting it to go. There's absolutely nothing subjective about this comment. And if you disagree, please put a question in and I will happily discuss that with you at the end of this talk. Another one is, well, I've run this on several browsers and this toast actually pops up on the top right, but our ticket specifies bottom right. Can we fix it so it matches our requirements? Again, even better, we have a referenced, vetted document that says, hey, we have an agreement that says this is where this toast is supposed to go, the little thing that pops up, notification. And we all agreed upon it that it was supposed to go on the top right. And you can clearly show and prove that after you've done your due diligence of running it yourself, that it's not going where it's supposed to, absolutely break that up. That is a valid thing to say in a code review, especially if, again, if you don't have an automated UI test library that can find this for you and alert you to it. So if you are doing this yourself and confirming that functionality, absolutely fair game to say something like this. This is another one. I'm having trouble keeping up with the logic on lines 457 to 464. Is there a way we can simplify it or make it clear? Absolutely nothing wrong with this, because again, that refers back to that complexity. If you are the only one that knows what is going on in this code, that's not maintainable for the rest of your team. It's probably not maintainable for you either, because the moment you're done with this feature and you move on to the next thing, and there's a bug that happens to come up that refer to these particular lines, it's probably going to be hard to get back into the context of what is happening in this code. So I would err on the side of believing the reviewer that is looking at your code, that is saying it's really difficult as is right now to know what's going on. And that comes back to where I was saying, you know, we're all highly intelligent people. We're all paid to solve these really awesome problems and code great complex things. But if we can't understand what's right in front of us right now, imagine how much harder it is if we ever have to refactor it, or if you had to pass it on to another developer. It's too complex. So it's absolutely fair to ask that person to either find a way to make it clearer, or at least even start a discussion with that developer to say, to maybe pair program and find a better way to write this code, refactor it so that it's understandable to all. And lastly, this method is being deprecated in 2 weeks. I'd suggest replacing it with the authenticate user method from our authentication library. Again, completely fair. This one actually stemmed from a real comment, which is basically the equivalent of are you not keeping up with like the programming subreddit? This library is going to be gone. Again, you know, sure, you can say it depends on your team. Maybe the team is not offended by it, but it's always better to just get to the point of why this is it without being sarcastic. So, you know, this is not to police your team and say, oh, you know, you're going to be super uptight and you can't joke around on your team. But in the context of the code review, there's so much that's missing that can be misconstrued. There's so much that you can misread into a comment like this in the context of a code review. So you might as well just say it, that this is being deprecated, and then leave a suggestion if you have a suggestion. And lastly, something that we don't often do, at least I haven't seen it in many teams or when I speak to other developers at the conferences I speak at, it's not very common, but if you see something you like, say so. So we are super, super ready to go when it's like, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is terrible, we're very good to critique, but if we actually see something that we like and say, oh, that's a very elegant solution to how you're solving that particular problem, say so. This not only builds rapport with your team, but it also helps train you to say, code reviews don't always have to be bad. Code reviews can be another way to give kudos to your team and to say, you know, it's not always bad. There are excellent problems being solved in really neat ways, and they should be shown and praised for it. So this is something I highly encourage. So in the end, all of these suggestions are kind of like this. They make you say, you got it. There shouldn't be any kind of resistance or pushback to any of these strategies because they take the dev out of it, except for the ones where you're praising them and saying that they're good. And again, it's not about, you know, not saying when something is wrong. It's just there's a better way to say it, and there's a more direct way to say something is not right in their code. And if you can refer it back to either your team working agreement or one of the code review goals that you have all agreed upon, then it's much easier for the developer to understand and say, oh yeah, what I wrote was not in alignment with something that we've agreed upon. And they're more likely to make that change, refactor that code, whatever it is, and you all will still like each other afterward. So that's subjectivity. The next thing is kind of overlapping with it, but I'm giving it its own time because it is something that was very much talked about when we discussed why we hate code reviews so much, and that is tone of voice. So this GIF encapsulates what I felt about code reviews for a very long time. And that was, why do people have to be so mean? Whether that's because, I don't know, because I was a junior before and they're like, oh my God, this junior doesn't know what she's talking about. Or there are other repos that were saying things that are not the best thing to say. But for this example here, I really tried. I said, you know, I'm going to try to look for an example in an open source repo that might exhibit what I'm trying to show here when I mean tone of voice. And I really hoped that it would take me a long time to find an example, but unfortunately, it did not take me a long time, and I found one right away. So here's one, again, from the materialize repo, and you can read what it says. Straight to the point, person says, this is terrible. And like I said before, we should just prevent that class from working on rectangular buttons. So why is this bad? Number one, this is an open source repo. So let's say it's someone's first time contributing to open source. If this was on their PR, I can guarantee you they are never going to go into any open source repo again. They're going to be scared. They're going to feel ashamed, embarrassed, and they're not going to go, probably not contribute anymore. Number two, sure, can you explain why it looks the way it looks and the way you think it looks? Can you give me more concrete reasons? It's almost like when you are in an argument with someone and they're saying, you know, well, just because, well, give me something. If you're gonna say something is bad, at least give me a reason why. And this one is clearly not giving any reason, anything at least that is of sound reason to say it. Sure, maybe when you look at it, it does look bad, but a better way to have said this would be, oh, this doesn't follow our style guide, or this isn't using our official colors for the repo or something. What is it? Why? Tell me why it looks like shit. There are other examples of this that are not so blatant, thankfully, but still fall under this tone of voice kind of issue. And these are comments like, this implementation is terrible, and that's it. They don't, again, they don't give any extra feedback. They just say, this is terrible. At least it's better if you tell me why, then I would at least know where to start. But if you just leave it at that, not that great. Or didn't we decide not to do this at our last meeting? So these are the devs that are like passive aggressive, who try to use these kinds of means. And really this is taking away from what is wrong with the code and putting the dev in the center spotlight. You're calling out this dev to say, you know, they're not listening and they're completely going against whatever standard was decided at the last meeting. Give them the benefit of the doubt. What if they were not there? If they were there, maybe they didn't actually understand what was being discussed. So you need to talk a little bit clearer. You need to communicate with your team a little bit better to know that you are all on the same page. The point with this comment that I'm trying to make is that instead of calling out the dev, just say that this was not decided upon, and even maybe reference the team working agreement that you've changed to reflect this decision. Or a comment like this, why would you use this when there's obviously no benefit? Again, it's almost, again, passive aggressive. It's almost calling out the developer. It's always saying, you did not think this through. And while there may be some cases where that is true, that they didn't do their due diligence, it's always better to try to find a way to attack the code itself, not the developer. And finally, things like, are you really using Lodash? Really? And, you know, to these kinds of comments, I would say, well, yeah, tell me why we shouldn't be using this. And, you know, yes, I know that sometimes maybe vanilla JavaScript is probably much faster. You don't have to add this additional library and bloat it up. But when you, again, leave it with just these these kind of snippy comments without at least giving your reasoning as to why you don't agree with the code that's being changed, or not giving alternative suggestions, then it just comes off as you being on your high horse and saying, this is terrible, fix it. Help your coworkers go on the right path of why this is. When you look at these things, when you look at these underlined words that I have here, it's terrible, not to do this, pointing out the dev themselves, what these equate to are like digital tomatoes that you're throwing into the face of your fellow developers. These are still your coworkers. These are still people you have to get along with afterward. These are the people that are maintaining that code base with you. Maybe it's even some of your old code that you don't, we don't need to be this snippy with each other, and there's certainly things that we can do better. So TLDR, don't be a jerk, right? Unfortunately, it needs to be reminded. Some people need to be reminded of this, but for a little bit more context on how not to be a jerk, I always give these 3 golden rules when you're about to make these comments. And that's, if you're about to suggest something in a code review, suggest with facts. If you're going to suggest an alternative library, tell me why this one is better than the one that is being used. If you are going to suggest an alternative implementation, tell me why this implementation is needed. Is it faster? Is the current implementation, does it have a race condition? Tell me why you are suggesting whatever it is you're suggesting, and give me reasonings as to why we should be listening to that suggestion. Because if you just suggest and don't back up what you're suggesting, it very much comes off as a preference thing, as a subjective thing, as in, I wouldn't have done it that way. Okay, why wouldn't you have? Explain why you would not have. Explain your decisions as to why you would choose the alternative thing. It's in those sentences and in those facts that the other person can understand where you're coming from and be less likely to take your suggestions as my way or the highway type of thing. They will actually be more willing to listen to your suggestions if you can explain why they would be better. Next, if you're going to reject, and we know that we're going to have to do this, I'm not saying code reviews should be all happy and rainbows and nobody hurts each other's feelings and all of that. There's going to be code that you just is outright wrong, and you're going to need to reject those code changes. But when you do that, do so with courtesy. There's no need for snippy comments. There's no need for calling the dev out. Do it as if you are about to, the better way I like to describe this is, let's say you are doing a code review with your kid or somebody at an elementary school, and you had to tell them why this is wrong. I don't know, maybe some do better with tough love, but for the most part, when you would tell someone why something is not done correctly in the way that they have presented, you usually do so in a very diplomatic way. You don't tell them, wow, you are a loser, why would you do it this way? Don't do it this way. You would say so in a different manner. You would take care not to let the person that you're rejecting know that maybe it was just a mistake, or maybe they didn't have a full context and understanding of what they were supposed to do, and thus this code is now the way that it is. So it's more like, don't be a jerk, and there's better ways to reject certain aspects of code with courtesy. Another big thing about this, if you remember the team working agreement, it is 10,000 times better to be able to have this document to reference now. So if you do see something that is out of line or just completely wrong, there's absolutely no harm in referring back to the team working agreement that you as a team have agreed upon. So if you see something that does not have standard naming conventions, if you see something that is clearly a race condition, or has some logical errors, or does not account for edge cases, point those out, say those things, and refer back to the team working agreement when you can. This does not match the standard naming conventions we have decided as a team. Referring back to these things is always easier to take as the dev who is going to be reading these comments. And finally, if you're going to clarify, and when I say clarify, maybe you're reading something in a code review and something's not making sense, or maybe you've been out of this particular piece in the code base and you maybe don't have as much context as the dev who was working on it. Maybe they have been working on this feature for 2 weeks and they have a better view of what needed to go into this feature. You're looking at it with fresh eyes. If you see something that sounds off or maybe wrong, clarify, but with an open mind. So something that is super common and is almost kind of annoying is, it's a typical scenario. I've been assigned to do a feature, my colleague is assigned to do something else. We're in different parts of the code base. As I'm working on this feature, I am in the weeds there. I know all the little quirks that are happening. I know what files are being touched. I know where this logic is going to go. And it's the same with my colleague. So as we are reviewing each other's code, and I haven't seen what context he has been working on or she has been working on. And when I see something that looks kind of weird, I don't go to this person to say, why did you, or this looks wrong, and immediately say this is incorrect. I would try to ask them for the context that they have had because they have been working on this for 2 weeks and I haven't. So getting clarification with your colleagues is, the goal is not to say, oh, my implementation is way better, or to start an argument with the intent to be you changing their mind to adopt whatever solution you had in mind. It's really to get that added context of why the developer made the decisions that they did, why the parts that are possibly confusing you or you don't understand, just getting a better picture of why that dev did what they did. And hopefully that enlightens you and helps you understand why you're seeing the code changes that you are. So if you follow these 3 golden rules, it's more likely to be a good time for everybody involved. And lastly, this one always gets really great discussions going, and that's process loopholes. So what does this mean in the context of code reviews? It means several different things, but all of them relate to just unfair things that are happening with the code review process that make you say, what's the point of even doing this? So what are those things? Number 1, bias. So who here has like a 10x engineer on their team? Or maybe you're the 10x engineer on the team. I'm the greatest engineer ever. Nobody ever questions my work. I write great code all the time. Don't even need to test it. There are many teams that have someone like this, where they either get to skirt by the code review process. They just let them merge directly because they're the rockstar engineer. You don't need to check their code. Wrong. Everyone needs to go through the code review process, no matter who you are. Other things. Have you ever had a couple buddies, favorite colleagues, where you say, hey, you go look at my pull requests and I'll look at yours? So this is fine, but how this is abused is if you always have the same people looking at your stuff, and even worse, they don't actually look at it. You just know that you're friends and you get things through and merged quickly without the real due diligence of really looking through and giving it a proper code review. That's another form of bias that a lot of developers have mentioned. They have 2 or 3 people are all in their little club. They just always approve each other's pull requests. And whenever it comes to their pull requests, either they don't look at it at all, so it's bottlenecked and it takes forever to get something merged in, or they don't, benefit from that. No one really trusts that whatever has been approved by this buddy team has actually been very well reviewed. If you are doing that, that's great. But the point of this is more to have your whole team, if possible, look at it. That's not always possible, especially for really, really large teams, but we'll get into that in a second. So another process loophole that's super annoying to maybe even worse than some of these loopholes is no reviews at all. It's very, very surprising to know that there are still many teams out there that actually don't have a code review process in place. You think that these are, they're almost part of your standard workflow now. Everybody's doing code reviews, but no, there are many teams that just don't have it at all. So they're falling into these traps and these frustrations because obviously what happens there? Anybody can just willy-nilly merge whatever they want. And when they run into issues, well, why do you think you're running into issues? So no reviews at all is probably even worse and something that a lot of teams are still dealing with. Next is something I like to call MVE. So I think you've heard of MVP, but I like to call this MVE. What is MVE? MVE is minimum viable effort. So who here has created a pull request? You worked on it really nicely. Everything is labeled correctly. You have the ticket linked to the pull request, so you know that the work you're doing is vetted and it relates to an actual task you're supposed to do. Everything is there, and this might even be a longer pull request. And maybe 5 seconds after you open this pull request, you see someone approve it. It did not take you 5 seconds to thoroughly go through my entire pull request. You know that the due diligence was not given to your pull request, or maybe you yourself. I know there have been some times where there are pull requests that they are just super long. This is another issue where, you open a pull request and it has like 45 files changed. Well, you got to give the other person some leeway here. They're going to get tired after maybe the first 5 or 6 files. So you want to try to keep your pull requests small as possible. But it still stands. There are issues with developers not giving a pull request or a code review the full due diligence that it needs. And that's where the bugs still come through, because you approve it right away. You don't want to look at all this stuff. You just approve it. And we really should try to avoid that. We really need to either set some time to say, okay, I need to go through this and give it the due diligence it needs, or else again, what is the point of having a code review if you're all not going to enforce that you're going to look at each other's code with a critical eye? So what can we do better with all of these scenarios? What are the things that will make these process loopholes hopefully go away, or at least make them better handle these scenarios? Number one, if you don't have a process, is establish one from the very start. So if you are one of the teams that does not have a code review process in place, or if none of your team members can actually agree on what all the steps are, that's a perfect time to get together and actually get on the same page. How many reviewers does it take to approve a pull request? For us at Mongo, we have at least 3 people approve before anything gets merged. That works for our team. Sometimes you need more, sometimes you need less. If you're on smaller teams, it's actually really highly advised to have everybody approve the pull requests. Now, not everyone can get that luxury. Everybody's busy. To get everybody's time to look through this can be difficult, but if it's something that you strive for and really make a goal as your team, make it a goal to have your whole team do that. If you are of a smaller size team, it is an excellent way not only to have multiple eyes look at that code and really get the full critique of that code, but to also have knowledge transfer and share what is going on in the code base. As part of those policies, so let's say, you say 3 people need to be approving every single time. And as this process, we do this almost every day. So this is a perfect task to automate. Why would you waste your time every time you open a pull request to add those reviewers? Auto add them. Not only does it take the work out for you, this cuts on that bias. This cuts on the, oh, only that person and that person is reviewing my code because you've requested them to review the code. If you auto add developers, number one, everybody is going to know that there's something that's about to be merged and will at least be notified that there's changes to be looked at. Number two, if you go even further and say a majority of those automatically added reviewers need to approve it, then you get that extra step of ensuring that fair people look at your code review, not just your buddies, not just this person or that. And also if the 10x engineer, rockstar engineer opens a pull request, well, guess what? There's going to be developers automatically added to review it as well. You're not going to be able to merge directly. So with this, something that's actually super valuable is something called the code owners file in GitHub. And it works similarly in terms of patterns to the git ignore file. But what this does is, let's say you make a change in some particular part of your code base. You can do it by file. So let's say, you know, any of your JavaScript files, or you go down as from the subdirectories or paths that you want to. Depending on the pattern that is matched, you can automatically add a specific person to that pull request whenever any changes are detected in that directory or in that file. So this is a great way to get, let's say, legacy code. You know where the legacy code is. If anything changes there, you know that this person and that person have worked on this code the longest. They should be looking at this code because they will be the ones who have the greatest input to give on any changes being made to legacy code. If you have a front-end team or a back-end team or someone who's a JavaScript expert or whatever it is, however you want to divide this, this helps immensely drill down to the devs and assign them, auto-assign them to the pull requests and have them look at any changes that are affecting their domain of expertise. And that way you don't get people who may not have anything to contribute because they've either never worked in that part of the project before or don't have, you know, any experience in that particular area. You get the right people looking at the right pieces of code anytime it changes, and it's a great way to do this. Similarly, if you use Azure repos, there is a similar setting that you can do that is like this. It's not a file, but you can go into, I think it is your branch policies, and do the same thing. So it's a setting when the slide panel comes out, you can say, oh, you use the same pattern matching here and says if these anything that matches this changes, automatically assigned this person to the pull request, and it will do that for you. And lastly, if this hasn't been made clear by now, you need to enforce the process for everyone. I've worked on teams where there were managers who knew just enough code to be dangerous, and they were allowed to merge into production because they were a manager. And needless to say, that turned out to be it was terrible for our team because obviously we had to fix it. But this goes to show that whoever is pushing code to your code base needs to go through the same process. I don't care what your title is. I don't care if people think you're the rockstar engineer who never makes mistakes. If its code is going to be merged in, it needs to go through the process. And it may be tedious at times, but in the end, you'll all thank each other for it because that's where the bugs skirt in. That's where the due diligence of making sure the code that's about to be merged really is needed and will actually improve the health of your overall code base. And by doing all of these things and taking many of these suggestions into account in your own teams, you know, after the PRs emerge, you still have to work with your teammates. So if you take any of these suggestions to heart, implement them in your own way in your own teams, then there's a higher chance that you can all have a fair, pragmatic code review process, but still like each other afterward. So that's all I have right now, and I'm excited. I saw everything blinking here, so I'm open for questions at this moment.
Great, thank you, Adrienne. Let's see, there were a couple in here. I was going to say this is an interesting one. I can remember where in I think this is on making comments. The comment was you could also do the happy sandwich approach, which is one, say something positive about the code, two, gently point out the area for improvement, and then three, end with another positive comment.
Yes, that is an excellent way to do it as well. So again, everything I have mentioned are just strategies I've seen that worked on my own team and strategies that I have heard other developers talk about. But absolutely, the core of what I said definitely matches this approach and makes it much easier to receive some sort of critical comments in a code review.
The other comment that I had was I know a previous company I was at, the team we had to come up with one of our working agreements, and one of our things was assume good intentions, and that goes in line with I think it's either in servant leadership or maybe one of the other things is that generally the people who do something incorrectly or in a way that they're not supposed to are generally, they're trying to do their best, but they also have been probably given the wrong instructions, and so they're just kind of following along, but they're getting so you can't get it give them a rough time because they're only being led by somebody else. So that's another comment that I had.
Absolutely. That's the core at a lot of these things. You never know, especially if you don't work on the team long enough, or more if you work on open source stuff. You don't know where all of these people's backgrounds are. Maybe they're just starting out with this and they have been led to believe to follow some sort of convention that, I don't know, may disagree with yours or may be wrong. I know in my own teams, our team had a kind of a tumultuous history. So basically the rest of our team were fairly new, and it was a complicated system, at least complicated to us because it was a completely new domain. We had to learn all the acronyms. We had to learn all the workflows and which users could do what things. So adding all of that complexity on top of just understanding what's right and what's wrong in terms of conventions, in regular programming conventions, you always want to give the benefit of the doubt, especially to your teammates. I mean, you're all in the same boat here. You're all working on the same code. It's just always better to give them the benefit of the doubt. And if you have the luxury to actually reach out to them and talk to them, like, when we're all back in the office, maybe just go over to their desk and be like, hey, what's happening here? Why did you do this? Or what decisions did you make that led to you creating this code or deciding this library?
Yeah, cool. Okay, and we got a question here from Sergey. What about developers who say, I have not worked on this project. I do not want to be on code review. Should they be convinced to participate?
Absolutely. I don't think they should. So this all depends on your team, right? I still think there's value in that person seeing what is going on in the code. So if it's a piece of your platform that they're not familiar with, either because they're new or because they haven't worked on it, sure, maybe you don't ask them because what kind of input would they be able to give, right? But I still think it's valuable, even from an outsider's perspective, to look at the code with their particular eyes, because they can still catch something that maybe someone else who's been on the team longer would not have seen. So to me, I always think it's always valuable to have as many eyes as possible, especially if it's someone who's going to be on your team. If it's another dev on another team, like on larger organizations, sure. Why, if they're not related to it or they're not going to work with it in the future, then sure, they don't need to be there. They can go away. But if they are going to be touching that code at some point, I still think it's highly valuable for them to view the pull requests, even if they're not making comments just yet.
Okay, Sergey says thank you. The next one is the code owner's file initialize your build? Does it, I guess it does it initialize your build similar to the .git ignore or requirements.txt?
I'm not sure. Are you asking if this is a default file that is added automatically when you create a new repository? Because no, it's not. It's something you have to add. But if that's not the right understanding of your question, I'm not sure what you're asking. But it is not a default file that is initialized. You'll need to add it yourself.
Cool. And I think there was a comment earlier as well in the thread on mob programming. I'm not sure if you've done that, but the comment was, hey, in mob programming, the design review or code review happens in real time.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's a great way too. I've had, when I've spoken to other devs, they've also mentioned, well, when it is the right time to bring this up. So some teams, they have, they run their code review processes at different times. Some do pair programming and they say, well, is this a right time to bring up these suggestions, or do I wait until the code review? I say, well, no, it needs to work for your team. If you're already working with your coworker on something and you see that at the time that it's happening, sure, say it and bring it up right away. I still think the way you say it and how you structure your comments or suggestions to them still applies, but absolutely, if you can catch it, the earlier the better. So as you're pair programming, you see something that's wrong, tell them right there. Don't wait till the code review. These suggestions for the code review are if your team follows a somewhat standard process of, you work on a feature, you're done with it, it's about to be merged, and then at that point is the only time anyone else looks at your code. So that's where you would wait and apply the same strategies.
And somebody's asking, is mob programming like pair programming, only more intense?
I would say so. So there's a lot of opinions. Too many cooks in the kitchen.
Yeah. So if you want to look, we don't have any recordings of it, but if you're interested in learning more about mob programming, Woody Zool is local here in San Diego. I know he travels around a lot doing a lot of seminars, but he has a lot of information on mob programming. So he's kind of one of the fathers of mob programming. So he's presented a couple times to the user group. But yeah, if you're interested in mob programming, definitely look him up. And it's Woody Zool, Zuill. I'll post that in the chat as well.
Sweet.
Okay, I have a question. Can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You treated most of the big picture problems I've experienced with code reviews. One nuts and bolts problem is on one project. We do reviews. Would have a lot of comments, and then the developer would go back and make changes, and then it was hard to track the comments. We ended up just not having any kind of process to make sure to track that comments got addressed adequately. It ended up not being a big problem, but it was kind of an annoyance that it was hard to, after the code had been changed again, it was hard to keep track of, okay, which line did this comment apply to, and now the line has changed. And
absolutely. So one of the tools that I love using is, I don't know if they have it in GitHub, but I know in Azure repos, in the settings that you set for your pull requests, there is an option that says anytime someone makes a comment, the reviewee, meaning the dev who opened the pull request, has to acknowledge it. And that's a setting you can turn on or off. But our team, specifically for this purpose, says, anytime we bring something up, you either have to acknowledge it by making a code change, so pushing a commit that makes this outdated, or you reply back with a comment that says, whatever the resolution is, or maybe they give their arguments as to why it should stay the way it is, whatever. But that has worked very well, because in the past, what would happen is we would get the code review going, and at the time that the code, the state that it was in, was mostly approved. But for some reason, something changed, or only after getting that approval did that person sneak in a couple commits. And then this person, whoever the reviewer was at the time, I only watched this from afar, but the reviewer is like, hey, wait a minute, these commits were not approved. And so there's another setting that you can set, which is obviously if any new changes appear on this pull request, you should automatically revert those votes that have been approved, so that you can now check to make sure the new state is in line. But they would do that too, where maybe there were comments that were left unacknowledged, but it would go by because they have already received the approved votes. So I will see if there's something similar in GitHub, but that's how we dealt with it. We were a full Microsoft shop, so everything was in Azure. We would use Azure DevOps, Azure repos, everything. And so in that sense, Azure DevOps was really nice, because it's literally a checkbox that you set. It's the same with the code owners file. They're all little checkboxes and settings.
All right, yeah, thanks for those comments.
Cool. All right. So do we have any other questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace. No? All right. Well, with that, I think we will call it a presentation. Wanted to say a big thank you to Adrienne for presenting to our group tonight. I know she does a lot of talks, so I'm happy she was able to squeeze us in on her schedule. Definitely follow her if you're interested in learning more about what she does and other talks that she gives. She had a lot of good sessions to choose from, so she's maybe we can try and get her back again to give one of her other talks. So a big thank you to Adrienne for coming in and talking with us tonight. And unless there's any other final questions.
Sweet.
No,
Thank you. Thank you
sounds
for
like
having
none.
me.
All right.
I was happy to be here. Glad that I could talk about this, but I'm also happy to come back and talk about more .NET related things as well.
Sure.
But
Cool. Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We'll post this recording to our YouTube channel in a couple of days. So definitely take a look at that if you know somebody who missed it and wants to watch it again, or you want to, put it on rotation for your morning viewing if you're doing code reviews. So definitely take a look at that when that comes out. With that, we will say good night. Thank you, everybody, for attending, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next meeting.
awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.